When I was 20, I fell for a boy.
This is a story about a ghost people who live in a ghost territory.
As a daughter of South Korean immigrants, I grew up being told stories about our homeland.
It's hard for me to comprehend that I am on death row for crimes that I did not commit.
If you step out that door, Tala, then you are choosing yourself over your family.
되게 아들이 했답니까?
근데 왜 자꾸 우리 애한테 물으시는 건데요, 그러면?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the REX Puncta Artist Talk Tuesday edition with Jess Handlekova, Mo Fung, Vince Ha, and myself, Keiko Hart. This talk is part of the 26th edition of the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. As we begin, I'd like to remind and encourage engagement with acknowledging the lands we are on that have made it possible for us to connect together online today. While the digital may at times appear like an abstract, ephemeral space, it is incalculable kilometers of physical fiber optic cables running through stolen Indigenous lands that make our meeting together possible. We are using Zoom, broadcasted through YouTube Live for this meeting, which are headquartered on the unceded ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone and the Ramaitash Ohlone, colonially known as San Jose and San Bruno, California. I am joining you from the traditional territories of nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, colonially known as Toronto. As I know those present may be joining us from different locations across the continent, maybe even beyond, I encourage you to learn more about the land on which you practice through resources such as native-land.ca. It's a website with an interactive map that details different territories and even has links to specific acknowledgements, treaties, and Indigenous languages. I would now like to invite each person in the meeting today to introduce themselves and offer a short description. I'm going to start first. So my name is Keiko Hart, and I'm the co-curator with Jasmine Gui for Puncta. I'm very, very deliriously grateful to be moderating this panel today. I am a white presenting Asian person of European and Japanese background. I am sitting in a room with white walls right now. I have long brown hair, a blunt fringe. I'm wearing a green sweater. There are a couple art pieces in the background. They're kind of small, so you can't quite make them out. One of them is a cyanotype print of a skeleton who is climbing over a wall. His underwear is showing, and it says, "Borders are silly." And then the other one is an abstract collage that is in red and blue. I'm now going, I'm going to pass it off to Vince Ha now.
Hi, my name is Vince Ha. I'm of Vietnamese descent. I'm currently sitting in front of an orange brick wall, wearing a black sweater. I have medium length curtain bangs. Yeah. Mo,
Thank
would you
you,
be
Vin.
interested? Oh.
Mo will have you speak next, just as Vince was about to say.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Mo. My pronouns are they, them. I am sitting in a room with a bookshelf behind me and a yellow chair with a photo on the bookshelf of the surface of the ocean. I'm wearing an orange toque and a tan hoodie with some clear framed glasses and short hair.
Thanks very much, Mo. And finally, we'll throw it to Jess.
Hi, I'm Jess. I am sitting in a very sparsely lit and sparsely furnished room on the ground. I am of mixed Czech, Cantonese, and Vietnamese heritage. Is subjectively Asian and more feminine presenting person with a black shortcut bob, wearing black headphones and a big white sweater.
Thank you very much, Jess. We have a very multi-talented panel today. I'll talk a little bit about my relationship with Real Asian. So in addition to working on this exhibition, I participated in their Codes of Contact program, which is an incubator for arts organizations engaged in the presentation of arts and cultural works, as the program's director for nonprofit Subtle Technologies. At Subtle Tech, I helped found the Curatorial Mentorship Program, which is an initiative that actively advises and supports the next generation of curators in an intergenerational framework of skill and resource sharing developed to ensure our changing realities through the pandemic. Keep an eye out for an exhibition in 2023. I've also directed and facilitated programming and curation at various nonprofit organizations and galleries, including the Toronto Biennial of Art, C Magazine, the Blackwood Gallery, Vancouver Mural Festival, and of course, most recently, Real Asians RX Puncta. Now, RX Puncta is a multidisciplinary exhibition currently hosted at the Bashir Yerrick's presentation space in the Commons on the 4th floor at 401 Richmond. The exhibition is made possible by the Ontario Arts Council and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. It will be open to the public until 6 p.m. on November 20th. It is well worth a visit, and this artist talk is only going to serve to convince you even further of that. Now, we will now jump into our question and discussion period. Should those present with us have a question or happen to come up with one during our discussion, please feel free to drop them in the live chat and our moderator team will share them with us. We'll first start with a round of questions from myself. So this is for everybody. Maybe we'll go in the same round we did introductions. So please tell us about how you came up with the works seen in this exhibition. Vince, you can go first.
Well, actually, for this particular piece, it has been a conversation that has been on my mind for a long time. And then over the summer, I was asked to speak at the Agnes Art Center in Kingston. And much of it has to do with that I wanted to focus on with community, especially within the Asian community, and overemphasis on harmony. And so I'm wondering, or I start to question about what are the spaces or places that we can speak about community disunity. And so that was something that I've been meaning to explore in a more material form. And so RX Puncta kind of call came out, and it was a way for me to kind of engage on it on a more personal level. And so I start looking through my family's history as a way to kind of engage into this conversation. So in Vietnamese, there's a saying that, that my mom often tells me, it would be "Hỏa từ miệng mà ra." The literal translation would be danger comes through the, danger comes from the mouth. But I also noticed that there's this emphasis on a one-way traffic flow. And so I titled my piece, Danger Comes from the Mouth, just to kind of also highlight that, there could be a two-way traffic flow, that what we take can also be dangerous just as much as what we say.
Thank you, Vince. We'll pass it over to Mo next.
Thanks, Vince. It's nice to hear you talk about it again, and because I feel like I learn a little bit more every time you visualize it in your own kind of world. So thank you. My piece was first created last year, almost a year ago to this kind of month and day. And I just felt a little bit stuck in my work and my art practice and what that meant and what being an artist meant to me. And also in these recent years, really coming into my layered and multiple identities that I carry. And being queer, being trans, being kind of this fluid body, especially in my relative and blood family, I feel like I was feeling a little bit of constraint. And so in this piece, I wanted to really engage people and myself to think about ancestry and ancestors. And I know that that's a conversation and a way of thinking that is often a privilege to a lot of people, to really know information about that part of your life and the access you have to that. And so that's been a thing that's been on my brain all throughout this journey of this work too. And more specifically, reaching beyond ancestors, but queer and trans ancestors of mine specifically, like really trying to figure out, who were they? I never had the chance to meet them, a lot of my family members. And, what would it be like to be in the same room with them, or the same kind of world in this current moment with them? And so this fishing net that my dad gave me to make this piece kind of symbolizes when I was born, my mom was working in a fish plant, and she was working there till the day she gave birth to me. And a lot of people would call me the herring baby. And so there's this link to how I think about myself in that context, and how the ghost money attached to the net, what that can signify and how that can be interpreted, right? And so it can be interpreted literally as fish in a net. If you look at the shadow play and on the wall and on the floor, and then it also is me, giving an opportunity for whoever's witnessing it to, have that moment to think about, okay, who would you send and burn this piece of ghost money for and to right now? Who would be that person, or what kind of community would you want to, share that love and care towards? And so I feel like this net and the ghost money is just kind of a vast space to, hold a lot of different questions and opinions and wonderings of people, and what life maybe looked like before they were here.
Thank you very much, Mo. We'll pass it over to Jess.
Ooh, I have chills listening to the two of you talk about your pieces. It's so good. So for my piece, if you haven't gotten the chance to visit the gallery yet, it's like 3 masks, these kind of like really large white artifacts that are hanging off of this bracket on the wall. And next to each of the masks is a photograph. And in the photograph, there's a figure like centered in the image. And it's of this figure in the city, moving, dancing, just kind of really feeling space with their bodies. And what these 3 images and these three masks document for me is sort of a 2-year-long ongoing project of mask making and of performance art, and kind of it's a project of self-determination for me as someone that sits between like cultures, sits between a lot of identities, kind of coming to terms with that. And then also locating myself as someone that was trained in architecture, finding ways to feel authority in spaces in a way that isn't harmful to others. Most of the work that is featured in this exhibit, actually, maybe I'll go all the way back to the beginning. When I first started making the masks, it was actually a group project, and it was for school, for a digital fabrication course in architecture. And we were supposed to make a lamp. And then I looked at my group of friends, and I was like, don't you want to be like inside the lamp? Like we should just make a giant lampshade and exist inside of the lamp. So that's where it started. And so many of the first series of these masks, they were more like light helmets. They were a much larger shell around a head. And then during my thesis in architecture, I was questioning sort of what is my place as a mixed person? What is my place as an architect who's supposed to feel like they have authority to design and create spaces. I didn't feel like I had that authority. I don't think people should have necessarily that much authority over other people's lives. And so a lot of the 3 masks were constructed during my thesis when I had access to a bunch of digital fabrication tools. And they're all cited on my own body because I knew that I had authority over myself. And it was an opportunity for me to kind of take up space in particular ways, in ways that made me feel more grounded. Yeah.
Very lovely. Thank you very much, Jess. I really enjoyed how Jess described their piece a little bit. So I might ask Vince and Mo to do so as well, just as we go into the next question, just before you answer it. So the next question I have is that the exhibition, pardon me, itself, Puncta, was enacted within an Asian film festival to host works that wouldn't traditionally fit into a black box screening or an easy Asian legibility, but that push against and through neat categorizations. How are your artistic practices and works in dialogue with Puncta or Punctum? I'll go to Vince first.
So my work visually looks like 3 bamboo vases placed on its side. And coming out of it would be almost like a stream of water that is made of different material that are stripped with fabric chiffon and photograph strips, mainly family photographs. The first one that is on the left-hand side when you walk into the gallery space is predominantly white, and it comes from a picture of my grandfather's funeral, which was held in Vietnam at that time. My mother was carrying me, and I was about 1 more month away. And in the middle, the second vase is predominantly red. That is taken from a photo of my aunt's wedding that was held here in Toronto. And I believe that was within the first year of my family moving to Canada. And then the last vase, it's a picture of my niece playing in front of my grandmother's funeral. And that I would say is predominantly black. And that was held in 2012, also in Toronto. And can you remind me what the second part that was?
Yes, completely. Thank you very much for that description. So we're talking a bit about the themes of Puncta and how their exhibitions formulated thinking about what pieces that wouldn't traditionally fit into a black box screening or an easy Asian legibility. We're asking that you talk a bit about how your practice or the works in this exhibition are in dialogue with the theme of Puncta.
Yeah, because I know that I think that you're in conversation with Bart's camera, Lucida, but I often say I'm not sure if my work has a punctum. And I say that, but part of me also believes in it. I think when I was approaching this work, I knew that it was something that I would sprawl out on the floor. It was something that people can interact, touch, and step on, and like the audience can really come into conflict with the piece. And it also is a way of me exploring my desire to kind of let go of order and control, especially of my own work, of how it's presented. Because at a certain point, when people are interacting with it, as an artist, you will not be able to go back and kind of fix your piece, or it belongs to other people. And so in a way, I was very surprised by some of the conversation that came about when people come and interact with the piece. They would tell me about stories and folklores of certain cultures. For example, another artist, another filmmaker, Amanda Wong, came to the opening, and she was interacting with the piece, and she told me that in Cantonese, there's also a folklore of a child being trapped in kind of like a water container. And in order to save that child, they need to break the vase, or they need to break the container and let the water out. So in a way, I thought that was very interesting, in a way that, the audience come in and have different interpretation of what the piece can be. And, what really struck me was how protective other people were of my piece. I also saw members of the audience go up to the piece and kind of turn the photos around to protect them from being stepped on. So all of these, but in a way, in my head, I'm also thinking about, control is also conflict, right? Saving something or protecting something is also a sense of control, and enforcing that sense of control, right? So I feel like, I feel maybe that's that's a way we could address the punctum, is that, each audience member will come in and identify their own moments of entry, their moments of conflict and moment of engagement.
I agree. That's a very sound note, because I think that moment of puncta is kind of individual, and so each person experiences it a little bit differently. And I think your piece very much achieves that. I'll pass it to Monet.
Thanks again, Vince, for talking about that. I think I remember we talked about how you were saying you just saw someone turn over the pictures, and it kind of made you giggle and then think about, how there was such a variety of how people are interacting with every one of our pieces, and also observing how other people did too. And so I'll first describe my piece physically, and then I can go into that question. But my piece is a kind of a green colored fishing net, and it's suspended with fish line to the ceiling, and those kind of ceiling beams. I don't know, Jess, there might be like a more technical term for that, but okay, sweet. And it kind of is in the shape of a funnel, or kind of gives this vortex feeling. And then it's about 75% closed with net and ghost money. And then there's an opening in one of the sections that's facing outward to the rest of the pieces in the room. And then at the bottom, it's slightly anchored by the weight of a rope that's on the edge of the net that's touching the floor. And so it's probably about 10 feet high, maybe 10, 11 feet high or something like that in height, and maybe, 4 or 5 feet in radius. And how to think about my artistic practice and how it's in dialogue with punctum and puncta. I think I wanted it to be sort of more spread out in the room in some way, where I have this vision, only because it's happened to me many times, but while putting the ghost money on and kind of having it hang in my house and putting it together, I tripped on the net 100 times, and what that made me feel and think about every time it happened. And I kind of had this vision in one moment where, what if I just walked in and there were, 3 people stuck in it, and like what they were thinking in that moment, and if they're even thinking about the piece, or they're just thinking about, they're on site of a mini panic about being trapped in an art piece and an installation, and I just kind of want a little bit of disruption in that way of, I think I have this conversation, with my close friends and my partner about, what do white wall galleries, feel like to different people, and what kind of, experience do they allow, to maybe I can word it like, white wall galleries feeling that fragility, or delicate materials, or not touching things, and not engaging with the work. You're standing behind a line, or it's kind of this robot feeling sometimes in gallery spaces, but I didn't feel that in this space. And I think there were points where I went up to the net and was shaking in, making the shadows of the money move, and the sounds that the ghost money made with the net. And I could see people glaring at me, like maybe thinking I was like just an audience member, like shaking this piece around, which I hope, well, that was encouraged. And I think people were definitely encouraged to, touch the pieces and, engage with it that way. And so, yeah, I think outside of that piece itself, my work and my commitment in the community is to do that kind of disruption and pokiness and challenging people in conversations, and broadening perspectives that can cause a lot of harm to certain people in certain communities and spaces. And so yeah, I think that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you very much, Mo. I think even if people weren't physically, literally getting caught up and disrupted in that net, I definitely saw them getting disrupted psychologically, mentally, while looking at it through the curator tours and the opening. So very much achieved. I'll pass it over to Jess next.
I think for me, I mean, like, not super knowing the like academic definitions of punctum, I definitely like Google searched it to be able to apply for this. But like what I saw this, because the way that a lot of the masks were documented was via like short film clips. And so pulling stills out from like certain scenes or certain movement pieces, it was really interesting to be able to like, what will someone latch onto or take away from it if they can't see the movement that's accompanied with the each image. And so in that sense, if you like, I think all of the images are quite dynamic in that it's not a stable sort of image. And part of that was just because they're stills or images of a larger moving piece. I guess that's the technical side of it. But I guess if I'm to interpret maybe what I've heard as people react to my work, it's a lot of, is it because the face is covered in such an intense way, it feels almost like a redaction, if that makes sense. Like it feels like my face has been purposefully redacted, and it's a nice artifact, but it has the same sort of aggressive redactive quality as someone putting a black box over a whole chunk of text, right? Like it, and I think that that's what I really liked about at least the first two that were more of a shell for the head. And I think that like people want to see your face, especially like, it's interesting that we're in this like Zoom call format. And I think there's a lot of body dysmorphia that people went through, facial dysmorphia in the past couple of years. When we're on this format, you're staring at your own face or other people's faces for so much of the time. It's like the unfamiliarity, but also the comfort that comes with being able to see someone's face, being able to assume a lot of things about them based on their face or their name or, any of those identifiers. And so maybe it's me hoping, but I think like when I'm listening to conversations about my work, I think it's like that erasure of the face in a lot of cases is maybe unsettling, because I do think a lot of mask work does focus on the face and the way that it emotes, like when you think of it in theater, or even when you're thinking about it in ritual use, people becoming like animals across cultures, that kind of stuff. It's all about what the face can symbolize and how that's transformative, versus this work, it's not quite so literal, and so people have to kind of like, what is my relationship to this, to the face, to the non-face? Yeah.
I think you nailed it, Jess. We love an honest confession. I don't know if I should call it a confession, but of Googling something, because I think when you talked about academia, academics hate admitting that they don't know a theory or a term. But I think you very much nailed what the puncta of your piece is about. Our next question is, how does or doesn't your cultural identity permeate or express itself within your work? I think Jess just touched on this a little bit, but how important is it for viewers to recognize these permutations, and why? I'll pass it to Vince first.
I think it's very important in my work. I think like if I were to look back, I think it's very easy to identify my culture and where I am. I think Jasmine also shared that, one of the viewer went up to the piece and were able to identify that, oh, this must have been a Vietnamese funeral. But I tend not to think about it when I'm working. Like I don't think about it in my piece that, oh, I'm going to inject my Vietnamese heritage and culture in it. I actually don't do that at all. But the thing is, often my work ground from my own experience. It's often something that I really want to explore about, whether it's that, like, history within the family, conflicts within the family, things that I'm trying to learn, things that I'm addressing. And so one of the things that, is a goal for me is that I absolutely have to be honest with myself. And that's my only criteria in my work. I don't really am concerned with other people, but, at the end of the day, I always question, was I honest? And that often that honesty it could play out in very ugly ways. And I have to learn to kind of embrace that. And sometimes it also bring out, I would say, negative portrayals of my identity signifier or identifier, which I'm also, I feel like, essentially I'm just making room to embrace these conversations. Yeah.
Thank you, Vince. We'll go to Mo.
This is something that I feel like I think about all the time, and the first thing that I'm thinking about is, over the past year and just before installing this piece for the first time, which looked really different than it does now. I think I learned about how this piece is like shifting in its form and shifting in what it can be, and mean to different people and for myself. I think a lot of my experience working on this piece, it's quite sad, and it brings a lot of grief when I'm sitting, with the piece surrounded around me, and it makes me sad that I do have a little bit of access through oral storytelling and through family and things like that, but I don't actually have something that I know for sure. And so at this point, it's dreaming about what that world was like, with trans ancestors and queer ancestors. And so I think my piece definitely holds at least the Vietnamese cultural identity and spaces that are part of me, and how there is this kind of dreaming these possible futures, but that also is coming with the weight of and grief and sadness of these stories that were never told, or people in my family or ancestry who weren't able to live authentically as themselves. And so I think about how is my work, giving space for those possibilities now. Yeah.
Thank you, Mo. And we'll go to Jess next.
Maybe building off of what I was talking about in terms of like the legibility and the redaction of the face. I think, I kind of told a story about how it evolved. It was kind of started off as a lamp and turned into a project of like questioning my cultural identity, kind of steep directionality. And I think the reason that it went in that direction is because the face is such a political space, especially in our current world, especially in a pandemic world, where that like how much or how little you cover your face or what you're wearing on your head has so much power. And we're so used to like even like passport photos, right? It's like that's how you prove identity, or like at least from the state surveillance aspect of things, it's like this is you. It has to be taken in this format of like, you have to look a particular way, and your hair can't be part of that. It's very much about the face and the head. It's a weird kind of consistent situation we're in. But when I started the first mask in my thesis, it was right after, I think it was around 2019, and it was in around the time of the Hong Kong protests, and they had just like I think banned masks in Hong Kong because people were using them to hide their identity. And I think in that sense, the mask was an opening up for anonymity, for like political conversation when the conversation was non-existent. And when you look up like in a lot of countries, masks are actually illegal because state surveillance, because people want to know who you are. And so all of that to say that I think the erasure of a face, or what masking can lend itself to, is sort of like I was interested in it related to my cultural heritage, because a lot of it has been erased either institutionally, like in different ways. Like I guess my mom coming from a Soviet Czechoslovakia, there's sort of a sense of institutional government mandated erasure of difference. And then my father being Cantonese Vietnamese, but I have a very strained relationship with him. And so actually it's fairly non-existent at this point. And so being able to reach in into that side and getting to know that side was a very, like, there's a lot of barriers. But as a racialized person, especially like an Asian presenting one, compared to my siblings, like I couldn't answer people's questions because I just didn't have access to that. So in some ways, that's what the mask is for me. It's kind of trying to figure all of those layers of political, cultural, history, and erasure.
Thank you very much, Jess. So we're gonna break for about 5 minutes, say until 2:15, just to give everybody an opportunity to use the bathroom or refill any beverages. And we'll be right back, and we'll move into individual questions followed by audience questions. So we'll see everyone in just 5 minutes. Hi, welcome back, everybody. Getting resettled. So now I have some individual questions for each artist, but if others want to weigh in a little bit or something piques your interest and you want to make a comment, feel free. I'm kind of going in the same order as before because I think it's been working nice for us. So sorry, Vince, I'm always asking you to go first. So a question for Vince, and something that he's already touched on a little bit, is around community and diaspora, because it's very important. And the reason why festivals such as Real Asian exist is to build upon that community. But as Vince said, an overemphasis on unity and harmony can end up kind of causing the reverse, because it shields us from difficult topics that are necessary for equitable growth. So Vince, can you, pardon me, expand a bit more on the relationship between community and conflict and how it intersects with your practice, please?
I actually started with community work before I did any artwork. So when I was very young, especially during the years that my parents first moved in to Canada, my dad was actually very active in the Vietnamese community. But after a while, I think he just kind of stepped back and focused on his family. And I didn't know the reason until maybe a little bit later. And he's, he was saying that some of the conflicts in the community, he just didn't want to be part of or didn't want to address. But it was also around the same time that I was very involved in the Vietnamese community. And after a while, I also felt that there was a lot of conflicts. So I kind of slowly withdrew myself, and kind of was also around the same time that I was exploring my sexuality and coming out to my family and stuff like that. So I kind of swivel and kind of focus my energy on the queer community. But then I also found out that, all the things that I was running from also exist in the queer community. All of those conflicts, all of those challenges. So it also kind of made me rethink that instead of avoiding, how can I really question myself and my engagement? And I always envisioned that community work is going to be something that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life, and I hope. But then what does that mean, right? What does that mean to engage? Because I think that I spoke with another artist a few years back, and I said that, sometimes I work with community and sometimes I do stuff on my own, alone. And I don't work with community. And I think they were sort of turned off by that answer and didn't really give me an opportunity to kind of fully express what I meant by that. But sometimes I feel like I'm placed in a position where I lead projects. Sometimes I'm also in a position to follow other leaders in the community. But then at times, especially when I'm doing arts, I feel like I'm a scout. And I need room to explore my own into territories, paths that maybe I have not traveled before, and I don't know whether or not it's safe to bring other folks along. And I particularly don't necessarily feel like it's actually responsible to bring a community along at that point. So when I came to this particular project, I really want to kind of, what is my particular relationship with community harmony and an overemphasis on harmony. And I find that there's a lot of echo in my family dynamics in terms of conflict and an overemphasis on harmony. And while I'm raising up the issue, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to diminish or weaken this idea of community harmony or harmony in general. I think what I'm asking is, how can we make it more flexible? Because I also find that, for example, my mom would tell me things like, keep your head down, work hard, and things like, danger comes from the mouth, right? But she has lived through a lot of experiences to kind of come to that shorthand phrase, to pass it down to me. I have not had the experience that she had, right? So I always compare it to my experience of teaching kids English, because you find a lot of English teachers tell kids, oh, don't start a sentence with the word because. And it's often because they don't want to spend the time to explain to kids what's the difference between a subordinate clause and a main clause. Because in order to do that, you need to explain phrase structure. And even in order to do that, you need to explain parts of speech, right? So it becomes this shorthand. But there are instances where you can, and actually it might work out to be the best instance to start the sentence with the word because. So we're taught not to speak up in certain instances because we're feared that, you know, there's going to be repercussion. But in certain instances, we need to speak up, right? So my question then becomes, you know, where are those instances where we should speak up? Where are those instances where these saying, that is passed down to us, it breaks down, it no longer works, it cannot serve us, you know? Things like forgive and forget, right? Also this, you know, keeping harmony within the family, keeping harmony within the community. But at a certain point, it cannot explain for all the scenarios, and it cannot serve us in, I would say, in a more delicate spectrum. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vince. I feel like there's threads there that really feed into this next question for Mo, where you were talking a bit about the experiences of parents or grandparents and how those actually can turn into unique pressures, I think, for generational immigrant children, because we haven't necessarily experienced what they've experienced directly, and it changes how we may interpret things. So for Mo, my question is around how the lived experiences of generational immigrants come with culturally codified roles around gender, sexuality, identity. You touched on this a little bit. I think it's very unique from Western narratives because of the added pressures of having to meet standards imposed upon us due to being immigrant children, whether that be societal, familial, like we just talked about, or otherwise. At the same time, as you were talking about earlier too, you're divided from ancestral lands, languages, cultures, and relatives, which really creates a complex push and pull in how we navigate expression. Can you speak to how this manifests in your work in a bit more detail?
Phew, big question here, Keiko. Yeah, my brain is kind of thinking about things that Vince just said. So a lot of it actually felt like it related to this question even, and the complexities and the layers of familial pressures and expectations and assumptions. I think I'll speak, you know, in the dynamics of growing up in my family dynamic. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. I can't hear you, Keiko.
Oh, sorry. I said, yes, we can hear you now. Can you repeat that first part that just was cut out that you just said?
I'll speak to kind of the familial dynamic of how I grew up and what that experience is now feeling like, you know, years later. I feel like a lot of my life is kind of flashing before me in a process and reflection way where when I think about myself at a certain age, I find it almost hard to believe that I even experienced the thing that I'm thinking about or that I have memory of. And yeah, I think in my family and blood relatives, it's like definitely I've been feeling currently, you know, complicated layers of what my role is and kind of, you know, being a mask presenting person, being the only currently queer trans person in my family. I often feel it's, you know, it's kind of a lonely experience. And that's why I feel so fortunate to have chosen family, right? And a partner and friends that I can, you know, express these things to, and also create art together and alongside these friends and chosen family. And I think while creating this work, and even just speaking with a friend over the break about how across different cultures and different backgrounds, we are experiencing simultaneously the same emotions and grief and sadness and wondering and dreaming and all of these things. And so it's making me think about, what that has done to create pressure on myself and how I move through the world. Before coming to Toronto to install, I was, kind of saying to myself, like, maybe this is the last iteration of this piece. And I don't know why I was so conclusive about that and why I felt that way. And I think it's that, feeling that, I think a lot of artists feel, or people who are creating things in the public, what people are going to think, how that's going to impact them, how it's going to impact you, how that's reflected back to you, and how that then impacts what it means to you. And I tend to overthink things and then come to conclusions without actually realizing that making this piece has like broken me open into thinking about possibilities of how I think and how I want to show up, in community and in the spaces that I'm in, whether that be in my art practice or just, being here and alive, Yeah.
That's really lovely. Thank you, Mo. I love that art has the power to kind of do that to us, because we're showing people aspects that are really personal to us, but also really politically charged in a way, like you're talking about, and it's tied to identity. That kind of feeds into my question for Jess. And so recent events around masking right now inextricably have made it a symbol for things like virality, infection, isolation, distance, but also simultaneously empathy, care, protection, collective health, community. Further, masks are something that have become really politically charged and have been linked to identity. Now, your masks are really distinct in that they don't have particular identifiers that are specific to an Asian legibility, which is actually something that Jasmine and I were really taken by, because I think it kind of pushes them through present stereotypes and categories into something beyond that. And so you've touched on some of the inspirations already that led you to this, but I wonder if you could expand on them more, maybe around the sci-fi, the futuristic, ornamentalism, and so on.
Yeah, I think because I did most of this work actually pre-pandemic, like building the masks and what they would look like occurred pre-pandemic. And so then suddenly masking was like at first it was niche. Like I was like looking deep into like Wikipedia articles about anti-mask laws in all of the countries, like most countries, like I mentioned before, have anti-mask laws that have to do with like government surveillance and an ability to identify people. And then suddenly the icon or the symbol of the mask kind of flipped completely on its head. Like, and for a really long time, I had a hard time reconciling that. Like in all the ways that I was positive and empathetic, it was obviously a very like significant source of contention for many people. And so maybe where I'll start off is I'm kind of more abstract, but like this is a very common interpretation of my work that I've seen as I've talked to people interpreting the masks that I'm making. And a lot of people look to it and see masking in the psychoanalysis sense, like a lot of us see it in the Jungian psychoanalysis, like we wear masks, being with different people, which is, I think, like on the one hand, an extremely valid interpretation, but there's a part of me that really wants to resist and fight back against this idea that like you wear masks, because like what happens if your face like is the mask? I don't know, like you can take that as deep as you want to go, but like I think that's what I was like being confronted with when I was looking at my own identity and my name and my heritage. People assumed a lot of stuff about me, asked me particular questions because of the way I looked. And I felt like I couldn't answer, especially on behalf of a community that I was fairly separate from. It felt like a real big overstepping of boundaries. And so where like, so you mentioned sci-fi, and that was a pretty significant part of it, because I think when you maybe don't have those in life representations, media representation does become a place to get that, right? And that's why Asian representation in film, like there's like, it's fraught in terms of like how shallow or deep you want to get with the kind of representation you want or want to show. But for me, growing up, I was really fascinated by sci-fi, and I think a lot of that came from that being the only place where there's like any form of Asiatic femininity, like an East Asian presenting woman that maybe kind of looked like me. I remember in grade 6, Memoirs of a Geisha came out, and grade 6 is like a weird time. You're going through your own existential stuff, you know, and it coincided with Memoirs of a Geisha. And as I said, I'm like Cantonese Vietnamese, not that anyone can tell where I grew up, the differences between different East Asian cultures. But they looked at me and they're like, you look exactly like the girl on the poster, right? And so then suddenly your entire identity compressed to a single image. This is the first time there's a big poster of like an East Asian woman, not sci-fi, obviously, but just film representation. But then when you look a little deeper in sci-fi, a lot of cyberpunk from the 80s was cultivated in an environment of extreme xenophobia and worry about American hegemony falling to like a rising Chinese kind of cultural economic power. And so there was this, like in Western media, villainization of Asian culture, and a lot of that manifested in these cyborg women, even recently, like an example, Ex Machina, and sort of like the cyborg, which is human on the outside. And then there's always that one scene where their face or some part of them is ripped off. And it's like, no, like you shouldn't have trusted them. They were this scheming, like robot this whole time. And so I think I pull inspiration from that just because of all of that complexity. Sci-fi is really cool, I think, thinking about futurities and the way that technology melds in nuanced ways that aren't oversimplistic with humanity. I think there's a really big opening up there. And so that's, yeah, I'm really interested in speculative futures, and I'm finding ways to like integrate that into my work. There's no clear, like, it's sci-fi-esque. Where am I going with this mentally? I guess maybe the last thing I'll end on is that I'm much more interested in the head as like a sensory organ. And that's where a lot of stuff comes from, right? I made this shell because I wanted to see my own heartbeat inside of it. And so then you need a surface inside for the light to animate. So it becomes spiky. It becomes a space inside of a larger space. And so that's why maybe those symbolic indicators aren't there, but it's still coming from a place which is my body and my lived experience. So there's a low hum of, I think, its relation to racialization and my cultural heritage. Yeah.
Thank you, Jess. I like that you touched on modern cinema representations, like because we're within a film festival where there is great representation, but I think in so much mainstream media it pulls so much from Asian stereotypes while not representing Asians at all in the actual media. And thinking about those futurities, pulling from what everybody said, you know, building community, chosen family, looking at inclusivity and representation, I really think the exhibition thinks about those things, and going forward, like thinking about futurity, those are the things that we want to see. So now I'm going to see if there are any YouTube questions. Welcoming the audience to like think about them, and please drop them in the chat. As those are coming up, we did actually collect questions at the gallery where we had a question collection box. And so I do have some questions collected from there that I'll ask through for you guys. Let's start with one for Vince. Surprise. Vince, someone asked, was there any specific intention in how you wanted to order the images? And I think this part also ties in. Was there a thought process behind choosing tulle and ribbon to weave the images together?
Keiko, can you just repeat the
Yes.
second half of the question?
I'm going to drop it in the chat too, okay? So
Okay.
the follow-up was, so it's, is there an intention in ordering the images as well as a thought process between using ribbon and tulle to weave them together?
Oh, yes. Okay. So they're sort of chronological, in terms of timeline, but it's also just a way of tracking, I would say, of how my family changes, right? So we end with, so the wedding is kind of wedged between two funerals. But the thing is, when we do the funeral in Vietnam, the predominant color is white. But when we host the wedding here for my grandmother in Toronto, it was predominantly black. So that you can also see a shift in the way that we carry out rituals, but also the way we operate as a family. I think for me, I was choosing different material because these were some of the material that were used in the funeral itself, or closely resemble material that were used in the funeral, especially with some of the fabric, like my niece's dress was in black, and it was like kind of like shinier fabric with tulle in it, or with chiffon in it. And a lot of similar fabric is also, especially the white versions, are also used in funerals in Vietnam. Same with the Vietnamese wedding, in terms of often there's 2 layers with a solid color and then one with it's like a more transparent and see-through color. But for me, it was more of the action. So I was more focused. I was like, okay, how do I strip the photos of their coherency and unity and fight against this kind of, and I also see it when people are interacting with it, because they're looking at these pictures and they're trying to reassemble the full image in their mind. But for me, when I was doing it, I was more, so all of the strips are exactly the same length and 2 inches in width. But the problem is I do all of this by hand. So there is no way that each piece can be uniform. So for me, it was just this process of doing a unified task, right? But the fact is that each time that I do it, errors come into it. And my errors is a form of conflict to the piece, that it cannot be unified, it cannot be harmonious, it cannot, like, even though from afar, perhaps it might look, the piece might look uniform, but they're not uniform. And that even the 3 bases, I think somebody was like, oh, it was very uniformly done. They're not. If you look carefully, they have their own faults and their own, because it's done by hand. And I, each time that I do something, something will go wrong, and it comes into the work and it stays with the work.
Thank you, Vin. I will say, I mean, it's not quite harmony, but there was such a musicality around hearing you put that together in the room as well, because I got to be present for that, and how the more ribbons were added, like when people touch them in the gallery, even now, you hear this shift of all the fabric, and it's really, really lovely. My next question is for Mo. Someone asked us, Mo, I'm curious as to the relationship between the dollar bills and the projection of the fishes. Is there one?
Cool. Thank you for sharing this question. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because it was pretty late in this process where I decided to use that photograph. And I was speaking with somebody at the exhibit who had a question about that too. And, they wanted me to talk about the piece. And then I said, well, what do you think about it first? And then I'll, build on what you're thinking about. And this person said, I feel that the money in the net is, in relation to overfishing and capitalism, and that then evoked sadness in this person. And I was kind of shocked about that interpretation, but not, that's what it kind of looks like if you see the piece. And I actually said to the person, I'm glad that you had an emotional kind of shift happen when you were thinking about that. And that is one way to think about it, and not really the focus or center of, I think, what I was trying to, engage those conversations about. But I have been thinking a lot about, ancestry in relation to non-human kin, and this work and those thoughts have been inspired by the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, and how, Robin talks about non-human kin and human kin in her work. And, that photograph I took underwater at a beach about, 40 minutes from where I am right now. I'm tuning in from Jabuktuk, also called Halifax, in Nova Scotia. And these fish, with that shadow of the net and the money, it almost has such a fine, detailed shadow where the net could possibly be a part of that photograph, and these shadows. And when I looked at the wall and the projection, having the shadow of the money in with the fish almost made it this kind of shadow of, what was once maybe there, or what, maybe existed. And it's not this kind of shape or form that you can identify easily, or some of the bills are crumpled up intentionally, and some of them are more flat and spread out and placed on the net in all sorts of areas. And so it's kind of like I wanted to leave it up to kind of the audience in the way of how they would interpret what the shadow play was in comparison with, fish and the ancestry parts of that. And if that even is something that they thought about, or I'm curious to know if those kinds of thoughts cross people's mind. And I guess, that's something that when you have your work out like this, you don't know, or you don't have access to those thoughts and feelings sometimes, and that's okay. And I don't need to know that. And I just want, conversations to continue about, if you're looking at this photo in this net, then how are you making a relationship with those things? So, yeah.
Thank you, Mo. I kind of have a follow-up, because I feel like you're already touching on this, that another person asked, which was, are there any responses or reactions you're hoping the audience has when they see their interactivity with your work projected on the screen? So I think they're thinking about their shadows, seeing themselves in the net and the fish projection. Are there any that you were hoping to come out, or it's really just you're happy for anybody to have the interaction that they're experiencing?
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because there was one point where you can walk through the space between the net and the wall, and there's, about 2 feet of space there, maybe, or 3 feet. And it makes a pretty eerie looking shadow and frame I took a picture of myself on the wall, and it's like my silhouette and the net and the shadows, right? Because if you didn't see it, you wouldn't know that those are pieces of money or ghost money. And you could see that it was something that might be stuck or being, there's a barrier between where it's trying to go and where it's coming from. And so, yeah, I've seen some, posts from people who have been visiting the gallery and how they chose to take the picture and what angle and things like that. And so I'm getting little bits of, seeing people's experience. So that's been really nice.
That's what we want. We want people to experience and interact with the work, right? I thought seeing your installation change from how it showed at Nocturne and seeing how this installation with the fish, for me, also had these really powerful themes around currency, because Vietnam, pardon me, is a coastal city and there's a lot of fishing there. And we're seeing herrings entrapped in a net with ghost currency, as you said, which maybe you want to expand upon that theme. But thinking about how, for me, it was like overfishing, but also like that overproduction and like all of this capitalism and profit now trapped within this net the piece is so arresting to me, and I had a lot of responses coming in from that direction as well.
Cool.
Did you want to expand on the term ghost money?
I could, yeah. Ghost money or just paper, I think, it's something that I've only learned. I'm learning about it still, and I came across a paper that actually talked about the monetization of even how we relate to ancestry. And so there's this quote in this paper, and it says, money is as important for the dead as it is for the living. And it made me kind of think about, okay, when did this start, this tradition and the culture of what money could get you access to, or what that meant in terms of your class or your status or resources. Like, I know that is a huge part of especially immigration culture of, that is a huge part of how you are perceived by the world and how you kind of measure your own self-worth or identity. So yeah, it's a imitation American bill. It's $100 bill. And so there's like probably a couple hundred of those pieces. And in Chinese culture, Vietnamese culture, and I think, more cultures beyond that, burn money, and where you're sending money to your ancestors or those who have passed away, and I think Jess and Vince, if you want to add, your own experiences and knowledge about this, but for me, it's burning those pieces of money, on a day of remembrance of this person's death. And sometimes I just burn it when I, walk by these pictures of my grandparents who I never met. And sometimes I just do it randomly, and then I feel like, am I doing this right? So I'm learning as I go. And so having my art in a space like this is such a big part of that learning process for me. So yeah, thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. I think we're all constantly learning about those things, especially when we're divided from family and things like that, constantly learning about your culture, constantly learning about your family. Jess or Vince, do you have anything you want to add to that? I'm going to go into a question for Jess then. So Jess, was there a particular moment during your journey with the masks that felt most transformative and meaningful? Somebody asked.
Actually, one sec. I do have a thought related to Mo's question really quickly, or just an observation is just as you were speaking, just the idea of smoke and shadows being portals or the in-between. I think it's so lovely, and like what a wonderful and fruitful space to navigate, I think. And that like crosses cultures, right? When we're thinking about Indigenous cultures and smudging, like there's that history interwoven with a lot of people's ancestry about how do we cross worlds and create space. Anyways, that's what I was thinking about. In terms of my masks, being like a inflection point. I feel like that's part of the reason I included the smaller mask, especially at this in the center. I have the two kind of shells on each side, and then there's this smaller shell, a smaller mask. It's like closer to a mask than a helmet. It like covers one part of my face. It's the left side of my face because my pulse is stronger to detect on my left ear. That's like all of these had circuits that hooked up to my ear, and it would detect pulse and then flash a light at the beat of the heart. And that was for anyone that would wear it. It was like a very easy sensor to put on. But it was funny because some people, obviously their pulse is stronger in the right. So I had to like drape the pulse sensor all the way across to the other side. And part of the reason, like over the course of the 2 years during my thesis, the mask evolution was definitely a reflection of the environment I was in. And a lot of people asking questions like, if you're looking at cultural identity, if you're looking at your heritage, why are you covering your face? And not understanding like how putting on something can make you feel more like yourself. And I feel like people that have, like to take something off in a lot of literature, like when we're looking at like feminist literature and that kind of stuff, it can be more liberatory. And I feel like there are less, maybe at least written in English that I could find that were like, putting something on or changing your appearance or like making this alteration to your body, whether that be piercing or tattoo or like wearing something that makes you feel more comfortable, more like yourself. We don't talk about the ways that we ornament our body to make us feel like more like ourselves, make us sometimes maybe feel more human. I think there's something fundamentally about putting something on that's, I don't know, there's a thread there that I'd like to follow. But that smaller mask was me being like, maybe I should show more of my face. And so I made it smaller. It was easier to dance in. I could actually see, which is, I mean, the piece is titled I Couldn't See, but it didn't seem to matter anyways. And like that one I could actually see, but then it cut into my face because it's a Voronoi tessellation. It's 3D printed. It's very sharp. And I wore it for 5 days straight for one of the final performances I did for Diaspora Asian Futures as part of Project 40 with Abby and Jasmine. And I was wearing it for 5 days straight and it cut a little hole in my nose. And then I was like, maybe I shouldn't be showing my face. Like something here is telling me like, no. And so like looking into the future, for me, I think that was like the mask got smaller. And for future projects, I'm definitely more interested in covering the face a little bit more now and playing with that, the shell again.
Just want to say we're a little under 10 minutes. So if there are any questions from viewers, because I see you in YouTube. You still got a bit of time to drop them in there. I also want to note that Jasmine just said I may have gotten emotional a number of times in this conversation. So lovely. Just because I don't see any questions quite yet, I thought it was interesting, Jess, that you just talked about, because I'm always learning too in these conversations, the pulse and how you had to change it when certain other people were wearing it, which kind of talks to, you've worn these masks, you've had other people wear these masks. Vince was talking earlier, like Vince's piece moves on the ground as we're going. Talked about how they wanted to see people caught up in their net. All of the works kind of have this physical interaction element that traditionally, in a very traditional gallery setting, people are kind of pushed away from touching the art. I'm wondering if everybody can touch a little bit on that as well. Maybe we'll go in reverse just to spice things up. Jess, would you like to start?
Ooh, very spicy. Hello. Yeah, I mean, what is it? I think Jasmine told me the other day someone came in and said they felt tricked that the masks are literally held together by tape. They're not, no, but it's like, I'm like, yes, right? Like they're not precious because the images conceal some of that. And so I think I'd always been interested in people getting to engage with the mask, and part of what makes them interesting is their unpreciousness. And it's me fighting it back against, I guess, maybe in some ways, my architectural education. There's a lot of object fetishism. Like if you're going to do or design an object, design an object really, really well. So it's like crisp, And then me, I was just like, I want to make images. like and dance around. So it's really great to see people like actually engaging with the work and touching it, because that's what it's there for. And it's getting to know someone's work in a visceral way, in a way that you might remember clearer because you've touched it.
That's just an interesting one. Mo, would you like to speak to that as well?
Sure. I just thought about how maybe folks who don't live by the ocean or have been by the ocean who have never touched a fishing net, that's a part of it too. And I think touching the money is important. It's like that, like this word, what's this word? You're like physically connecting with this ghost money that then is going to be sent to somebody. And so it's kind of like leaving parts of you with that, if you want to think in that kind of depth or layer. But yeah, it made cool sounds and made shadows. And I really, was trying to work with the light in a way that, helped create depth with those shadows. And I don't know why I'm so fascinated with the shadows at this money. And that makes the first time I installed it, the lighting was really different. The room was almost, it was super dark in the room, and the lights were colored coming from the bottom instead of over the top. And so, yeah, I want people to touch my work. I want it to be inviting and welcoming, and not something that is too pristine or too precious or off limits or inaccessible in that way.
Thank you, Mo. Vince?
Can I say it's so nice to answer last?
I'm sorry.
But,
it's happening now.
But I really want to say that Mo, what I really like about the piece was that when somebody would touch your net, the money seems to float, and the shadow seems like they're a school of fish too, right? Or some sort of being also part of that image that you projected, right? And it feels like it also brings the piece alive. And yeah, so I just wanted to share that I really love that aspect of the work. What were we talking about? Touch. Yes, I'm sorry. I think not all of my pieces, or not all of my work, have a component where people can interact with it. I think the last time that I did a piece that had a major kind of like tactile, like interaction moment was at the previously called the Canadian Lesbian Gay Archive. And they were throwing out a lot of like artifacts that could have been important for other communities. And so there were a case of these kind of like old VHS tapes, which I collected, which either they had duplicates or they didn't want anymore. And I would cut them and ask community members, and we would sit down and we would write all the names of community members who have died of AIDS, updated, because at that certain point, the AIDS Memorial didn't have all the new names. And when we weave it into a piece of work with these names dangling, not in any particular order, because the AIDS Memorial is actually in alphabetical order. And, people would come and interact with it, and then, somebody might be bursting into tears because they're like, oh, this was a family member that they happened to find. And of course, there's thousands of these strips. So the chance of them running into a name that they find is, it's however long they engage with the piece. They might not run into a name that they find. And so work like that really inspired me to challenge this notion of touch with audience member. And with this piece, I find it really interesting because, like, even though when people are trying to avoid not to step on it, when they're backing away, when they're crouching down, they inadvertently step on something else, right? They might be avoiding to step on one trail, but they end up traveling on a different trail. But I find that, when people get, especially to the last one with my niece's space on it, people have a very hard time knowing that they've stepped on it or they don't want to step on it. And I think it's also culturally that we've been conditioned not to step on photos or photos with faces. And so I see that kind of sudden change in people's behavior with the piece too, right? They come in direct conflict with the piece. And now they have to navigate that conflict. So they have to make decisions, right? They have to make decisions whether or not they want to protect the piece or, but the thing is, it leaves it in their hands of how they want to, how they want to address that conflict. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Vince. So we're going to go just a couple minutes over time because kindly we have our audience asking us the question, and it's the only question that we've got from them. So Boris has a question for Jess, and it's, do you foresee an iteration where the shape of the masks reflects the instances in which they are worn or used within your cultural background?
Really great question. Thanks for asking it. And I think it's something that after going through this whole process and questioning all of the things that I had questioned, I finally at a space where I feel like I can approach learning about and kind of educating myself about parts of my cultural heritage that have been lost thus far, like specifically the Cantonese and Vietnamese side of my cultural heritage. I can now approach it with care and go slowly and to tread carefully kind of, and to not do it for the sake of anyone in some ways else but myself, and to let whatever is produced be part of that healing. I think I'm at a stage where I can cross into that. And so mentally I have an idea of what the next one is. And I know that I want to incorporate Cantonese opera water sleeve technique because I'm very interested in ways that we have ornamented our bodies in the past have become extensions of our bodies, especially in performance and kind of those kinds of spaces. And so as one example, that's where I'm going, but no idea how that's going to pan out. Yeah.
We're excited to see it. We're excited to see how it pans out. Thank you everyone for your question. Thank you, Boris, for your question. Thank you for this discussion to everybody. Thank you for sharing your arts practices and reflections with us, artists. If this piqued your interest in the audience out there and you want to learn more about artists and what's coming up, like Jess was just talking about, you can follow them across social media at their various tags, which Jasmine dropped into the chat, or you can find their websites, which also dropped into the chat. If you want to learn more about Puncta and the other featured artists, Noor Khan, Branavi Jayasundaram, and her collaborator Yasmin Namatala will be giving an online talk moderated by co-curator Jasmine Gui on Thursday at 6 p.m. EST. You can find the link by going to realasian.com and searching Puncta, or it's also posted in the live chat now. This talk has been recorded for us and it'll be made available online on the RAX Puncta page at a later date for you to access. RAX Puncta is open to the public each day between 1 and 6 p.m. until November 20th. In the Bachir Yerix presentation space at 401 Richmond, as I mentioned earlier. There are also many other Real Asian events taking place over the coming week during the festival, and you can check out the screenings and related events taking place at realasian.com. With that, thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone who came.
Thank you, Keiko, Jess, Mo.
Yes, thank you all.
Yeah, y'all are so brilliant. I'm just sitting here like,
Yeah, it was so heartwarming what you shared.
it's so nice that we got to meet in person. And for even just for a little bit,
Mhm.